This is episode 604 of the Rio Grande Foundation's Tipping Point, New Mexico. I'm Paul Gessing.
And I'm Wally Drangmeister.
I'm president of the Rio Grande Foundation, New Mexico's free market think tank. You can find out more about the foundation at riograndefoundation.org. Wally, this 4 to 5 day school week thing just keeps getting batted around like a tennis ball in a Wimbledon match here. It's pretty crazy. The latest news, and I think we talked about the fact that there was a lawsuit last week that had resulted from 53 school districts, a majority of the state's 89 school districts, suing the governor to prevent her 5 day school week mandate. A lot of those districts have 4 day school weeks and were not excited about forcing their kids to ride the buses for an extra hour and a half each way every day, or at least 1 day additional a week. Teacher commute times, administrative time. A lot of people really like the 4 day school week. At least a lot of people, as in parents, teachers, administrators, and students. Other than that, really other than the governor, everybody likes it. And a judge has put Lujan Grisham's 5 day school week mandate on hold, which, as we know, it's May. My kids are eagerly awaiting, a few weeks from now when school lets out. So I don't know what this really means because a lot depends on the speed of the judicial process. But I would say that for next year, for next fall, it's not looking good for the 5 day school week mandate. I don't think this is the kind of thing you can throw together and, maybe at winter break or something. That would be pretty interesting to see. But this is on hold for now, and we'll just see how the process goes.
Well, there was a former Albuquerque Public Schools superintendent who shall remain nameless, but he always used to say, the schools are a big ship. It takes a long time to turn it. And, that was an excuse for never making any progress, in my opinion. But in this case, you're out there figuring out, are we going to have 4 days? Are we going to have 5? If we go from 4 to 5, how many of our teachers are going to quit? And what are the issues around that? Plus, the whole fact is it an overstep of what is authorized legally from the administration? All very good issues, and I share your hope that it might be resolved, but I'm not positive that that'll be the case. Maybe it will.
Yeah, well, it doesn't have to be resolved necessarily because you do the math here, and we're getting into lame duck stage for Michelle Lujan Grisham. So if we get through the next school year, that really just means one more year under which we'll be dealing with Lujan Grisham in the governor's mansion. Obviously she can still make the change. It could happen. The judges in the appeals process, presumably this would be appealed one way or the other. I fully expect that this kind of question will be addressed by the New Mexico Supreme Court. But looking at it from a judicial perspective for just a second, and I'm no lawyer, but the legislature, it's not like this is an issue that the legislature has kind of taken a hands-off approach on. They've passed specific legislation with specific debate at the time in 2023 about this issue and the time in the classroom issue versus the days of the week issue. And we've gone over that. And, obviously, if you extend those 4 days somewhat, you can avoid a 5th day of the week. It's pretty straightforward. Then you had the legislature in this session specifically adopting provisions to say, no, you can't force the 5 day week. You have to keep it at 4. Now, the governor does have the line item veto, but it's pretty clear what the legislative intent has been in recent years on this issue. It is really just the governor deciding and trying to ram this through the process. Now, so if you're a judge, you have to look at, well, does the governor have the right to essentially directly contravene the legislature in multiple ways to impose her own policy. If this was something that hadn't been discussed and debated in the legislature, and they never made their intents known, that would be a different situation. But the idea that the governor can just mandate by themselves a major policy change. I mean, I know Washington and the Supreme Court are looking at the Chevron doctrine, which deals with regulations. This is a very uh, big regulatory grab on the part of the executive. And I think, regardless of if you're a Democrat appointed judge or well, they're all appointed from the Democrats, so we'll just stick with them. Even though they're all Democrat appointed, they have to be concerned with separation of powers here.
Well, Paul, a theme that we've seen nationally, frankly, internationally, and certainly in New Mexico is that the balance of power between the three branches of government, the executives are taking ever more liberties with the constitutional powers and the separation of those powers as they were laid out. And the courts sometimes address that, but man, it's a question, in my opinion, that the legislative branch of government is just rolls over and plays dead and continues to have their powers eroded to the point where if the executive can always override the legislative, you don't have a three-part government anymore. So I don't know what the answer is, but this is a practical example of what's happening with this conflict between the branches of government. That's for sure.
No question about that. All right. Well, in typical New Mexico fashion, according to an article from the Center Square, one of these online, reporting, kind of from the center right perspective. I was quoted for the story, so I'm familiar with the situation from that. But $6 million being spent by the state of New Mexico on four solar projects. So, solar panels being stuck out in the desert, so called renewable energy, the energy transition. And the issue that Center Square found is that at least for three of the four projects, a spokesman for the Environment Department admitted that it does not have an estimate of the amount of clean energy that will be created by the effort, nor does the department know how many jobs will be created by any of the projects. And I apologize, it's the Economic Development Department, not the Energy Department. But uh, this is exactly the kind of thing that we've seen in recent years from the state of New Mexico, from the Biden administration, where they just push these so-called green agenda items. Whether they're green or not is a different question, but they push these spending and subsidy policies forth with little to no analysis of what their ultimate impact will be. How much energy is being created? We don't know. How many jobs are being created? Understanding, of course, that we know that by taking money out of the productive, i.e., the private sector, and putting it into a government spending project, you're inherently reducing the amount of jobs and economic impact. But understanding that they also should have those numbers before they break ground and spend this kind of money.
Well, and not to get too geeky, as I'm sure they don't know, and the reason they don't know is this thing, Paul, called the duck curve, where with regard to solar power, in the middle of the day, there's an awful lot of it, and there's typically not enough transmission and distribution infrastructure to get that power where it needs to go. And so you have an excess. And so it doesn't surprise me that they don't know. But, without places like California, Paul, largely already have enough solar for where they are right now. They have too much. We don't need any more. They need batteries and they need ways to take care of the energy requirements of a modern economy when the sun isn't shining. And so, can New Mexico get there very quickly? The same place as California? It looks like maybe we are. So, yeah, it's not looked at systemically. That says, okay, what do we need in the way of new transmission? What are the utility incentives and all that to make it happen? We're just going to add more solar and hope for the best.
Yeah, and of course, um, if you were building, a shopping mall or some, road or something, there would be reams of environmental permits and data about uh, endangered species, or what are we disturbing here? Maybe some remains from some tribe that was once on that territory. Maybe those are being done, but it certainly seems like the impetus is very much to not worry so much about the real environmental impact of these massive arrays of solar panels throughout the desert, and their impact on wildlife and the microclimate and other kind of things that are getting in the way. And we've seen that recently in the SunZia situation, where you have kind of a split with the environmental movement on one side saying, oh, yeah, get that power line through. We got to deploy the renewable energy. We got to get it here in New Mexico and send it over to California, i.e., the Martin Heinrich approach, versus tribes and people concerned about the high tension wires running through the landscape and the environment. On the other side of legal challenges, uh, right here on these projects, on other solar projects, other wind projects around New Mexico, haven't seen much in the way of opposition. Maybe that's just because they're building them in places at this point where they don't have any issues. But as these projects have to be deployed further and further afield, you are going to further encounter opposition and issues with these wind and solar projects.
Well, and Paul, they have issues. Make no mistake about it. If you look at what rooftop solar its impact is from a land use point of view, you put some solar panels on your roof. Does that attract because they're dark? Does that make the area hotter in your neighborhood? Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. But you're not using new land for this. When you're talking about these large scale solar projects out there, they blade off the land. Nothing grows under there to speak of. That's not this environmentally diverse location for sure. And then the one that continues to get me is the windmills. They have a lot of issues with microclimates. They certainly continue to kill birds by the thousands, if not hundreds of thousands or millions, because guess what? We don't want to talk about those numbers. When the oil and gas or the electric utility industry kills a bird or two, it's front page news literally for one or two kills. And I'm not saying that's necessarily wrong, but there is certainly a double standard here. And yes, this is an issue we're going to continue to face with our current energy policy. If we're going to plow forward on some things, there will be a lot of unintended consequences, not unforeseen, just unaddressed. And this is going to be an interesting one to see. What happens. We build all these solar panels. What does it really do in terms of changing the landscape? Pardon the pun there of our energy environment here in New Mexico.
In the words of the greatest living economist, Thomas Sowell, there are no solutions, only trade offs.
Oh,
Yes. So, moving on, last week we talked about the challenges that companies like UPS and FedEx have been having in adopting electric vehicle technology for their delivery vans. And I discussed last week that this was a relatively low hanging fruit kind of situation, theoretically, but the companies were going bankrupt, the batteries were in short supply, and UPS and FedEx, to name two major companies, were struggling to embrace the EV so called revolution. Literally, the next day, I see an article from Channel 13 KRQE saying that New Mexico is handing UPS specifically $473,000 in federal grant money to replace 16 old delivery vehicles. Now, the story does note that these are not EVs. These are compressed natural gas vehicles. So it's kind of a surprise that the federal government would even get involved with uh, deploying anything besides electric vehicles at this point, because the zeitgeist, the mindset of the Biden administration is really that of the major environmental groups, which is fossil fuels bad, uh, electric vehicles good, or anything electric is good, which is also Martin Heinrich's approach. But uh, I think the big thing is the federal government is using our tax dollars through the state of New Mexico to hand 473,000, nearly a half a million dollars, to a major profitable private, publicly traded company, but a privately run business to buy trucks. And you know, this kind of story doesn't necessarily make national news. Corporate welfare these days, the government's gotten so involved in all aspects of the economy. But goodness, where does it end? FedEx, you can bet they'll be next in line saying, hey, we'd like to see some free trucks around here, paid for courtesy of the taxpayer. And I would imagine that a lot of other businesses will eventually try to get their nose into that particular trough. But yeah, Wally, this is a pretty incredible story here.
Yeah, Paul, there's a saying that the demand for free is easy. It scales up easily. So if you're giving something away that has any value, it can do that. It is interesting that using NGVs, I happen to know why they are and not electric, because electric is a horrible technology right now for these sorts of delivery vehicles. You can't get the power, you can't get the vehicles. The charging is problematic, and NGVs, I know more about that industry than I should. I worked on that once, in the words of Star Wars, in a long time ago, in a galaxy far, far away. But NGVs work for delivery vehicles. You can use a overnight slow fill, which is a very inexpensive piece of equipment that can fill these trucks. And if you want to do a fast fill NGV, it reminds me a lot of a fast charge EV station. It's very, very costly, so that doesn't tend to work economically very well. But yeah, trucks that sit idle for a period of time overnight or just a period of time during the day and can be filled on a slow fill with natural gas tend to work pretty well. It's not all roses. NGVs, usually the fuel cost, and particularly
So
now,
NGV, that's natural
natural
gas
gas
vehicle.
vehicles.
Okay.
Yeah, natural gas vehicles. The price of natural gas is relatively low right now, so that's good. You get a little less horsepower out of the vehicles, so you might need slightly larger engines if you're going to really be hauling freight at capacity. But this could work. But then again, the question is, why is the federal government giving it to these companies? So it's very interesting, and I do have a feeling they tried to do electric vehicles and were just unable to even find a place that they could even get a demo project to work.
Yikes. Well, it,
That is speculation, but prove me wrong. I mean, think about it. If they could have gotten one to work, why would they have?
yeah.
Why would they have done this? I think
Well,
the point's
the
well
good news, I
taken.
guess, is that these vehicles are useful. They are better for the environment. They are a technology that actually has proven to work. Natural gas vehicles have been around for a long, long time, and I once upon a time back in 2001 lived in Argentina, and they were quite commonplace back then. So that's the good news. The bad news is that now we're getting into the world of the federal government working in cahoots with state governments like New Mexico to provide these for private businesses, which is problematic to say the least. All right, well, uh, we had talked a few weeks ago about the federal government's U.S. Department of Education's report about all the ways in which New Mexico's education system is not getting the job done. That was the Consolidated Performance Review Report for fiscal year 2023. If you would like to go and read that little document for yourself. It's an in-depth document, but really you can get by with just the first few pages of basic information, the charts and whatnot. Uh, 60,
It's sufficiently depressing just to read the
yeah,
summary. You don't need to dig deep to even.
yeah. So 60 PED requirements reviewed by the Department of Education fell into the lowest ranking, and Rebecca Dow, in a recent piece that appeared in the Albuquerque Journal, Santa Fe, New Mexican, Las Cruces Sun News, and others, uh, highlights some of those problems. We've done so here: state assessment requirements, accountability system, support for school improvement, state and local report cards. Those are just some of the, I think, big ones. And then preparing, training, and recruiting high quality teachers, principals, or other leaders. That was one that was across the board a very problematic category. Anyway, uh, Rebecca Dow, she heads up our Opportunities for All Kids education project. She's, of course, a former state rep and candidate for governor, and she highlights ways in which really we need school choice. We need to empower parents and families to make the decisions on education that work for them. We realize, as does Rebecca, that we're not in a position in New Mexico right now politically where this will happen. The Democratic Party is essentially controlled by the education, the teachers' unions, and they're not going to go for this kind of choice. But if you don't make the case, you never get the policy. That's one safe way to do it. We are going to continue here making the case for education reform in this latest federal report. In a sane world, in a sane state, would be enough, I think, to maybe convince policymakers who actually cared about turning around our education system to embrace some needed reforms. So, unfortunately, I don't think they're going to pass a education savings account in the next legislative session. But darn it, they should. And Rebecca's spot on. So check out that particular policy brief or op-ed and the brief from the federal government.
Yeah, and Paul, it comes back to the issue is do the does the legislature and the governor care about education in New Mexico? Literally, do they care if it works or not? Because right now, just another set of bad news. This time from the feds. So I guess to feel good about our education policy, we're going to have to block these reports on the internet from even coming into the state because it makes us feel bad about ourselves as a state, but not necessarily bad enough to do anything about it because we are there. We have hit rock bottom, and there's really nowhere to go. And we'll have to see if some changes are made or if we're just going to wring our hands and uh, maybe look into the camera with a sad look and say, we're doing everything we can.
Get a little Sally Struthers,
Oh,
maybe
yeah.
the arms of an angel. It's
There.
if the children were dogs, we saw. Don't want to go down the Christy Nome path, shall we say?
Yeah,
But
let's not.
certainly, the reaction to that, it seems like there's a lot of people out there who prioritize animals above humans, and I think we might want to consider some prioritization in some of these areas. And I say that as the owner and lover of two dogs. Guessing dogs do very well for themselves. All right. Well, the race for U.S. Senate in New Mexico is continuing to heat up with Nella Domenici and Senator Martin Heinrich uh, running against each other today. As we record this, May 7th is apparently Pete Domenici's birthday, and on Sunday there was kind of the dueling articles, the pro con, but I'm going to specifically highlight one and respond to it, which is Gail Chasey, one of the very most progressive New Mexico legislators, a Democrat, really highlighting the kind of the mantle that Pete Domenici had as U.S. Senator and heading through Martin Heinrich as being a group of senators that were known for bringing home the bacon. And just as a quick aside, Chasey being one of the most progressive people in the legislature, a progressive body that it is, I probably be hard pressed to find anything positive that Chasey might have said about Pete Domenici when he was actually in office. There's a tendency among some, let's just say, Democrats to uh, the next Republican is always the worst Republican, whoever's there, and then they wax eloquent about, oh, Nixon was so great. I love Nixon, or George W. Bush, or you name it. They may get ripped apart when they're actually in the game, but then the moment they leave the game, suddenly there's a soft spot there for them. But uh, what I am concerned about and really found kind of perplexing about Chasey's piece is that you know pork barrel spending is one aspect of what U.S. senators do. It is not the most attractive or, I think, fulfilling part of that job because Domenici, Bingaman, Udall, on to Heinrich, they've all brought home the bacon. Now, I don't know if you could even come up with a mechanism to highlight who was the porkiest U.S. senator. I'm sure somebody may have data on who did the best quote unquote job of bringing home money. But look, this is not the way that New Mexico is going to achieve economic prosperity. What we actually need is good policy coming out of Washington, D.C. And you know, I think it's safe to say that Martin Heinrich has been among the very most left wing U.S. senators. He has towed that line, and he uh, has definitely voted very differently in his time in office from Pete Domenici. And that's what voters need to be cognizant of and understanding of is that Martin Heinrich is really representing the radical environmental groups, not the citizens of New Mexico when he goes to Washington.
Yeah, Paul. And then, when you start comparing eras, it's almost like who's the greatest of all time in the NBA. Politics changes. But one thing I will say about Pete Domenici is yes, he worked to make sure that federal spending on things like bases and the labs was going strong in New Mexico. But keep in mind, he was one of the senators that was key to controlling spending during a large part of his tenure there. And boy, that spending control has gone by the wayside. We saw the last few years of government spending exacerbating an already inflationary environment to the point where now, even if inflation slows down, there's certain key things like food and housing that have just seen tremendously large jumps that are, frankly, putting more and more Americans out of the running to try to get to middle class, and so there's that whole thing there as well. So yeah, I would say that did Pete Domenici do okay bringing money to New Mexico? Yes. Was any of that money that was poorly spent? Hey, it's the federal government. Of course, some of it was poorly spent. That's not the question. But when we look at what Senator Heinrich's focused on, it tends to not be a New Mexico first. It tends to be kind of that national progressive uh, agenda first and New Mexico second, or if it gets some benefit from it, so be it.
Yeah, undoubtedly. And it is worth noting that uh, Heinrich is in line if he is reelected and the Democrats maintain control of the U.S. Senate. And so there's a couple of caveats there. But if reelected and if the Democrats control the U.S. Senate, Heinrich will be chair of the powerful Environment and Energy Committee in the U.S. Senate, taking over from Joe Manchin. Now, within the understanding that these are both Democrats, I don't think you could come up with a more polar opposite duo of U.S. senators when you talk about energy policy. Joe Manchin, of course, uh, known as a moderate senator, uh, coming from a coal state, West Virginia, kind of a traditionalist when it comes to energy. Heinrich is wild-eyed. While New Mexico is an energy state, he has no inclination to supporting traditional energy that pays the bills around here, i.e., oil and gas, or let alone coal. Does nothing to promote nuclear either. Really, just wind and solar monomaniacally. I'm going to use that word. Those are his. That's his real approach, and so there are real issues with him getting reelected and the power that he will wield if he does get there on that committee, and the big changes that would be wrought under Heinrich's leadership of that committee. So, uh, we're also, of course, looking at down the road, and I really started to dig into this based on these articles. Uh, Heinrich is widely rumored to be running for governor in 2 years. I I've got to think that if the Democrats do keep the Senate and Heinrich moves into this top slot on the committee, and it's coveted committee on the issue that he cares about more than life itself, I would think that that might keep him in Washington D.C. So maybe there's a silver lining there, but he'll be busily destroying the energy industry in the United States from Washington. It's a very fraught situation. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, it will be absolutely interesting politically to see what happens. But at the end of the day, it's going to come down to what power. I mean, what power is exerted and what policies are implemented. Whether he's in Washington or if he comes back to New Mexico. So stay tuned, folks. It's easy to do the soap opera cliffhanger. Will he get the chairman? Will he come back to New Mexico and be government? Stay tuned.
Well, of course, that's yet another point for Nella Domenici to run on to highlight, because having talked to her and her campaign, I know that energy is definitely a top tier issue for them. And really, I think anytime you're running to challenge somebody, you're going to be pointing out areas that you feel that they are particularly out of touch or maybe uh, radical. It just so happens that energy, A, is of utmost importance to New Mexico. B, it's Heinrich's biggest issue. C, I think he is the most outside of kind of traditional norms when it comes to energy policy. I'd have to go back and look, but I've got to imagine that with Manchin in that seat, chairing that seat, that Heinrich could be the most anti-energy chair of the Energy Committee in the U.S. Senate in the history of that body. So that's kind of a bold statement based on not a lot of history of that committee, but I would be willing to bet. I mean, he's among the most anti-energy U.S. senators in the history of that body, and unless Bernie Sanders has been on that chair, I think I'm pretty safe with regard to that statement. Finally, New Mexico is under two health emergencies currently. Bet you didn't know that. So that's why we tune into the show, don't we?
Let me guess: education and street crime.
Sense of humor there, Wally. Sense of humor. I like it. We can even have jokes about the public health emergencies. Well, the answer is no. One of these deals with what the governor calls gun violence, which apparently is only if you use a gun is it a crisis and worthy of a public health emergency. The other deals with drug abuse. These expire May 17th. So, in case the governor actually allows them to expire, which she has proven very desirous of the power that comes from these public health emergencies, will continue under these orders. I would imagine that gun violence is definitely going to be sustained through the special session. It's kind of the raison d'etre for the special session on July 18th, or at least starting on July 18th. Drug abuse, that's another one. I mean, there are these public health emergencies that are pretty much evergreen. The question is, what are you actually doing about them? And I mean, drug abuse is a tough issue to begin with. The governor certainly seems gung ho about getting marijuana from the border to to the rest of the state.
I don't. Is that what that isn't what the drug abuse emergency is about, though? I don't
Oh,
believe is
I
making sure
suspect not.
marijuana is available. So,
Yes, that would be a very interesting use of the
say,
public.
yeah, are we for it or against it? I can't remember.
Yeah. Anyway, those are your two public health emergencies, which you probably didn't know they were there. You probably have zero impact on your life from them, and it, I think, further just erodes the importance of these public health emergencies, which I don't think, and maybe I'm wrong again, but you know, having lived here since March of 2006, I don't think we had a public health emergency until COVID in March of 2020. And now the governor's like kind of found this new toy. It definitely highlights the need for the legislature to weigh in to reform it and have a seat at the table. And if we're going to be in a health emergency of any kind, we should actually have some kind of impact on the way things are operating here in our state.
Yes, it's very interesting. And the drug abuse emergency, Paul. Yeah, boy, there's very little disagreement that we have a problem here in New Mexico, and there's more and more information coming out. I read a report about the age of fentanyl abusers is going lower and lower and lower, and so there are a lot of things going on, and so it's like, okay, fine, it's an emergency. What's the policy? What are we doing about it? Because just to mindlessly say it's an emergency, and is that even the right thing? Let's face it, the gun violence emergency and her proposals, those definitely did not. They hit with a thud. You know, there's been no real constructive action that either the courts, public policy, or lack of any other activity really has made a difference on anything with that. And yet here we are, we have them. So what are we doing about these? And if not, yeah, that just seems like maybe the emergency is the blue ribbon panel of 30 years ago. Whereas if you wanted to act like something was important but not do anything, you used to form a blue ribbon panel to get the best and brightest to come up with solutions. Maybe that's what these emergencies have turned into.
All right. Well, we are going to leave it there, Wally. Thanks for listening to this week's episode. Find all episodes at tippingpointnm.com or at the Rio Grande Foundation's YouTube channel. Subscribe to this show at Apple, Stitcher, or tell Google Home to play Tipping Point New Mexico. Thanks to Path 3 Marketing for producing this show.